Okay, the first part I talked about a lot of the historical part of the Texas Constitution, and there were two sections that we covered. And the first one was about the 1869 Constitution. And in that one, you should have picked up that there was a lot of power that was given to one office, and that office was the office of the governor. And so it caused all kinds of problems. So we went back and we said, no, we need to go ahead and change the Constitution. And so the Constitution that we are working on right now is the 1876 Constitution. So this part two, is going to be giving you information about what the Constitution looks like today. Okay, it has been said that Texas does not have a living constitution. And basically the reason that they say that is because it takes a lot to get things passed within the framework of the Texas Constitution. And one of the reasons that they did that when the people that wrote the Constitution, is that they did not want the legislature to have a lot of power. So there's not a lot of flexibility built in. But on the other hand, it's not really serving the current problems and the concerns that we had in the current population and the problems that we have today. Okay, so every single constitution has to have certain parts, and they're called articles. So Article 1 will provide the Texas Bill of Rights. And so this tells us about the fundamental liberties that we have within the state of Texas. Now, there is the U.S. Constitution and the amendments that we have, the Bill of Rights under the U.S. Constitution. So this one is giving you information about what Texas has in addition to what the U.S. Constitution provides. It's Article 1. Okay, way back when they were writing this up, Texas was kind of progressive in a lot of ways, because what it did is that it prohibited sexual discrimination at that time, and sexual discrimination in the workplace and education, that type of thing. And this was before the different laws were passed at the national level. Not only that, it also guarantees the victim's rights. And there's a difference between being a victim and being the perpetrator. The U.S. Constitution, basically the 4th and the 14th Amendments, have a lot of rights for the person committing the crime, but it doesn't really speak a lot about the victim's rights. So Texas said, well, what we need to do is we also need to have different provisions to guarantee that the victims are going to have some kind of support system. And the support system can be, sometimes it's in terms of dollars, money to help you bury somebody that may have been killed. It was like a victim of the homicide. It might be counseling. And so in order to qualify for some of these types of victims' rights, it's usually done through the DA's office. Like in this county, in Wessex County, it's done through the district attorney's office, and that office will refer you to the office of the Attorney General of Texas, and they're the ones that have that program. Now this next one, we do not have a debtor's prison. And what that means is that you cannot go to jail just because you owe money and you're not paying your bills. So it forbids imprisonment for debt. So if you have debt collectors calling and saying that they're going to be putting you in jail or throwing you in jail because you're not paying your bills, don't believe them. We're protected by it. So it forbids imprisonment for debt. Now, under the Texas Constitution, it also forbids committing somebody to a mental institution for extended periods of time without a jury trial. And so what that means is that if there's a situation that you have a loved one, somebody from your family or whatever, that you feel that they need to go into some type of facility, you can't just put them in that facility. You have to go to court. There is a trial, and it's a jury trial, and it is the judge that tells you they are incapable of handling their own affairs, or they can say this person is a danger to themselves or to others, so we will have them committed to a mental institution. But the judge is the one that has to declare that. The judge and the jury has to declare that they are mentally incompetent, whether it be for themselves or because they can't handle their own fiscal affairs, their money affairs. Now this next one, the writ of habeas, suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus just means show me the body. And so what that means is that if you are arrested, you have to be charged. You cannot just stay in jail forever and ever and ever. You have to go in front of a magistrate, in front of a judge, and they have to tell you you are being committed for you are being arrested for this crime. You're going to be able to bond out. You have to stay in jail, released on your own personal recognizance or whatever. You cannot prohibit that right that you have under the Texas Constitution, habeas corpus. In Texas, we're a big private property state, which basically means, we hold our property, our personal property, our private property as being sacrosanct or being very, very holy to us. And so what this says is that in the event that you have to declare bankruptcy, and if you are current on your mortgage and any kind of like second mortgage that you might have, they cannot take your house away. It cannot be part of the bankruptcy, that you cannot lose that. So it protects your homestead. And in Texas, there is no garnishment of wages except for child support. So let me explain this a little bit. There are certain institutions that can take your money, but these are more like federal institutions. Like, for example, if you owe money to the IRS, they can go ahead and take some of your money. If you owe money to the student loan people, they can go ahead and take some of your money. Okay, when it comes to this thing called child support, it's not considered to be garnishment of wages, because what it is that if you are working and you have a job where you have a regular paycheck coming in, the judge can order in the court order saying you will be paying child support and this is how you're going to be doing it. So they just kind of take it out of your check. So it's not really garnishment of wages. It's more an agreement saying, yes, judge, I agree to do that. I don't want to go to jail. So basically, in a lot of ways, the Texas Bill of Rights provides more protections than most other state constitutions. So in that way, we have been very progressive. Okay, all constitutions also have to say, okay, how are we going to split up the separation of powers within any particular state? And so typically there is a legislative branch, there is an executive branch, and there's a judicial branch. So this is a separation of powers just like at the U.S. level. And so each of these will provide a system of checks and balances. So let me give you an example of this. The executive office is the office of the governor, and here in Texas we have a plural executive. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And so the governor has the ability, the constitutional right to sign legislation or veto legislation. I'll talk about that in a little bit. The legislature is the one that passes the legislation. That's their charge, is to pass the laws. The judiciary has the right of judicial review, saying, are the laws constitutional under the Texas Constitution? Are the executive orders that are issued by the governor, are they constitutional? So that is called judicial review. So each has separate functions, but there is some sharing of powers as well. Okay, so we have two chambers or two houses. We have the Senate, and the Senate is the senators run based on their party label, so they're partisan elections, and they serve 4-year terms, and there's 31 members. So there are fewer Senate members than House members, because if you look at the House of Representatives, there's 150 members, and they serve 2-year terms. And this all has to do with the size of the districts. And when we get to the legislature, we will be talking a lot more about the districts and how they are. So the Senate has large districts, the House of Representatives has much smaller districts. And again, they're partisan elections, and they will serve, the senators serve 4-year terms, which is a little bit different than the U.S. level. They serve 6-year terms. The House of Representatives is the same. They serve 2-year terms. Okay, and so they will meet every other year. Biennial means every other year, and they will meet in odd years. And they will meet for only 140 days. So what that means that there's a lot of legislation that gets introduced, and a lot of it doesn't receive or may not receive a lot of attention. I think the last legislative session I heard that there were like 7,000 pieces of legislation. So consequently, many bills may be ignored. But when we talk about the legislature again, I'll tell you why bills get introduced and how they get killed along the way. Now, after the legislative session is over, if the governor feels strongly enough that something else needs to be done, that there was an agenda item, an issue that he wanted to take up, and it was not passed by the legislature, but he feels very strongly about it, that he can call a special session. And the special sessions are only 30 days, and the governor's one that calls them. The governor's one that gets to decide how what's going to be covered in that particular special session, the agenda. So because the Constitution kind of limits what the legislators can do, at the end of every legislative session, we have to approve many of the laws that have been passed by Congress. I'm sorry, by the legislature, the Texas legislature. And so they go into the Constitution, they're put into the Constitution. And this is through a legislative statute, and they're codified. It's called statutory law. And so we the people, the residents of Texas, say we approve of this or we do not approve of this. And it's usually something that has to do with that's going to affect a large number of people, or that it's going to affect the money part, the budget part, that they're asking the people of Texas to pay for something. Like one of the constitutional amendments that had like vast approval, like maybe 85, 88%, was a constitutional amendment that was about the same-sex marriages, which is no longer in effect. But at that time, the constitutional amendment said something like, in the state of Texas, marriage is between a man and a woman. Again, it passed with great support or whatever. But then the Supreme Court decided that was not going to be the way it is. And so basically all of the distrust of what the legislature does or can do to the state of Texas, it makes it difficult for the state to adapt and to change to the needs of what's going on in the state. And again, this all relates back to what happened in Texas in 1869 of big government. It doesn't really matter that much in the state of Texas if you consider yourself a Democrat or a Republican, a conservative or a liberal. Texans by far tend to be more conservative in general than most other states. Okay, the second branch of government is the executive branch. And this is the one that speaks to the plural executive. And so the governor is the one that heads up this executive branch, but he's not the only one. So the governor again also runs on a partisan election, or based on a partisan election, and he has a 4-year term. And so there's more restrictions of what the governor can and cannot do in the state of Texas than most others because of what happened in E.J. Davis. So what happened is that they said, you know what, we don't want the governor to have so much power in the state of Texas. We don't want that to ever happen again. So what we're going to have instead in the state of Texas is this thing called the plural executive. And so what that does is that divides executive powers among several offices. So it's a sharing of power. So the executive powers are shared amongst the governor. He heads it up. The lieutenant governor, which is kind of the second in command. He's the one that's in charge of the Texas Senate. And he runs based, it's not like president and vice president, but he's kind of second in command. And he runs based on his own office in his own election, his own partisan election. The attorney general is like the head lawyer for the state, the chief legal counsel for the state. Other offices include the Comptroller of Public Accounts, which you can say is like the CFO, like the Chief Financial Officer for the state, the Commissioner of the General Land Office, and I'm going to talk much more about these when we talk about the section on the Executive Office and the bureaucracy. The General Land Office has everything to do with the public lands in the state of Texas, beach renourishment, the oil and gas exploration out into the waters of the sea, so that type of thing. Now the railroad commissioners there's 4 of them, and they have districts as well, and we vote them in. And again, all of these are partisan elections. And so what they do is, it doesn't have much to do with the railroad anymore. At one point it did, it doesn't anymore. But what the importance of this particular office is that they set the oil and gas rates for the state of Texas, which for the state of Texas, it's a big deal. Okay, at this particular point in time, they're all Republicans. So according to the Constitution, and I said it just a minute ago, that it is limited, the governor's powers are limited. Because this is the only thing the governor can do. He has appointive powers, which means any office is not an elected office, the governor can recommend somebody to serve in that office. And so it is the governor recommends somebody, the Senate is the one that confirms it. It's advice and consent, just like at the national level. The governor can veto legislation if he completely disagrees with that piece of legislation. The governor can item veto parts of the legislation, and the parts that he can take out are the appropriations or the money part. And so he may say, I may not want to kill this entire bill, but I don't like this part of it, so I'm just going to take out the money part of it. And while you might have a program on paper, if you don't have the money to deliver that program, you might as well not even have a program. So it's an item veto on appropriations, the money part. And as I said just a little bit ago, that the governor is the one who has the sole responsibility to call these legislative sessions for 30 days outside of the regular sessions that the legislature has. So as you can see that the governor is a relatively weak office in the state of Texas, basically because we have that plural executive, basically because we do not want to have a governor that has a lot of power. Okay, the third institution that we have, political institution for the separation of powers, are the courts. And so the courts are very fragmented in the state of Texas. And for the test, this first test, there's just like two things that you need to know for this one. First, that there are two courts of final appeals. You know, everybody knows that at the U.S. level, there's the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, in the state of Texas, it's a little bit different. There's a Texas Supreme Court that handles only civil appeals cases, and civil appeals have to do with things that are not crimes. That's a court of criminal appeals. Those are the criminal cases as opposed to the civil cases. We're going to be talking much more about that and the differences between the two when we talk about the courts specifically. But you need to know that there are two different ones, and for these that the judges are elected. For all of these, the judges are elected. Okay, the Constitution also says, okay, there's going to be other courts. And I said it's very fragmented. We're going to go through each of these when we talk about the court system. There's an intermediate court of appeals, and then we have state level courts, district court, county level courts, justice of the peace courts, municipal courts. There's many different levels, and again, we'll be going through all of that. But I'm just introducing this to you right now. Okay, so these judges are chosen based on partisan elections, and so one of the reasons that the Constitution was written this way, because they said we don't want judges to be on the to serve long periods of time like they do at the U.S. Supreme Court in case somebody's not a good judge. How do you get rid of them? It's hard to get rid of them. So this is an accountability measure, saying we can always vote a judge out. But generally, it's not desirable, because what happens is that if a judge is going to be elected, he becomes a politician. And so then the question is, well, you know, the judge, or it gives a perception that that the laws may not be applied uniformly, because if a particular industry, for example, is sitting in front of a judge, you know, some kind of a situation, is that judge going to be too lenient, or is that judge going to be more of the finding it to be more beneficial to that particular company as opposed to one who did not contribute to his particular campaign? Okay, so the Constitution says, all right, so tell us about local government. How are you going to do local government? And so local government is basically the city and the county. And for in the state of Texas, because Texas is so big, we have 254 counties in the state of Texas. That the counties are the ones that do a lot of the work for the state of Texas. So the Constitution provides an organizational structure of how it's going to be set up. And so they are the ones that will, you know, for example, when you register your car, you're registering your car for the state of Texas, but you registered it in your county. So they provide a lot of those. Now, cities can only exist if the state allows them to exist. So they have to petition the state and say, state, or the legislature actually, we would like to be a city. And so there's a couple of ways that you can incorporate. And the first way is called a home rule city, and it's based on population. So if you have a population over 5,000, you can adopt a home rule charter. If you have a city or a town that's under 5,000 in population, then you have to adopt a general law city. Now, when I talk about suffrage, I'm not. This is not when you're saying, "Oh, I'm suffering, I'm suffering." This is talking about voting. And so when it comes to everything that has to do with voting, it's handled at the county level. It's a function of the state and the local governments. It is the county that sets everything up, and then they report to the state. And when we talk about voting elections, we'll be talking more about that. But the state is the one that sets the requirements. So this is what it says, about voting in the state of Texas. That you can register to vote as long as you are not an idiot, a lunatic, a pauper, convicted of a felony, and that you have not gone through the pardoning process, and I'll talk about that later on, can vote in state and municipal elections. There's a lot going on right now in the state of Texas. And well, I mean, historically, there's always been a lot going on in the state of Texas, and things continue to go on in the state of Texas because of a lot of the issues that we have had with voter and voter fraud. But we'll talk about that when we talk about voting in elections. Okay, but the thing is at the state level, when it comes to the amendments, and I said just a little bit ago that we have to vote these amendments in, but the voter participation rate of people actually going to the polls when these amendments come out, it's low. It's low. I think the last go round that we had, the participation rate, people coming out to vote for the amendments, it was like 3%. 3%. That's not much, right? There's a little bit better voting rate, a little higher voting rate at the local levels when you have municipal offices running, like the mayor and the city councilmen, women, whatever running. So a little bit more success of that in that, but not a whole lot. Okay, a lot of times what drives people out, especially at the local level, is the ability for people to have a say in what's going on. It's called direct democracy, and this is for home rule cities, those cities that have over 5,000 that incorporate as a home rule city. And I'll talk about that a lot more, but for right now, this is what you need to know. If there's an issue that you want addressed at the city council, they can say yes or they can say no to put it as an agenda item. Now, if they say no, but you feel very strongly that you want to go ahead and have it placed on the agenda, or have the voters voted in, this is a process that you follow. You can get a petition drive going. Those are the initiatives. And so the petition drive is you have to go out and you have to get like X amount of signatures, and that X amount of signatures depends on the population. And right now, based on the population of Corpus Christi, is somewhere around 13,000 registered voters saying, yes, I support this initiative, I support this petition, I will sign it because I think it's important enough that we need to go ahead and take up this issue, even though the city council doesn't want to take it up. Okay, if you're able to get enough people to sign that and it's verified that they are registered voters, then it can go on the next ballot so that we, the people, can vote it in. So that's called a referendum. So the initiative is a petition drive. The referendum is the one where people can vote it in, yes or no or whatever. And then when it comes to local government, we don't have impeachment like they would at the state level or at the national level. In order to remove a city elected official, you need to have a recall election, a popular recall election. And so what that means is that you have to get, again, the petition drive going, the initiative going, it has to get on the ballot. So we have to vote them out. We voted them in and we have to vote them out. Special election, it's a recall election. Okay, so to amend the Constitution, all these constitutional amendments that I'm telling you about that we're going to, they should be coming in pretty soon. Well, after every single legislative session, you're going to have an election. It's going to have all of these amendments. And so in order to get something to that point, it's got to be what they call like a supermajority. It's got to be 2/3 of each of the chambers of the Senate and of the House that they voted it in, saying, yes, we think this is important enough, and we want to go ahead and propose it. But the people have to have a say whether or not they think that it's going to be a go. And that's called ratifying the amendment. And so the ratification requires approval of a majority vote. A majority vote is defined as 50% plus one, not 51%, 50% plus one. And so it will be either in a special election or it can be at the next general election when these types of amendments are going to come through. And I've seen them both ways. I've seen them both ways.